Stories shape the world, it is said. But who do stories actually shape? So the short and obvious answer to this is, of course, everyone. But I think there is merit in going into further detail about the mechanisms by which stories shape us and how we can use the power of storytelling to take control of our own life. As with most things in my life, I wish to begin with talking about children. When I was 6, I fell off my brother's back, and that's how I first began to read, all by myself. That story is not important. What matters is the first story, or rather the first book that I ever read, this one. Brothers Grimm did not actually create all these stories. These have been handed down since the 1700s, now collated in the 19th century, being read by children the world over to this day. Like a mother tongue, these are acquired and passed down generations. This brings me to an important aspect of storytelling. The author is not oftentimes the most important person in the life of the story. The story evolves, picks up new authors along the way, much like a beautiful flower in a garden and bees getting attracted to it and spreading the pollen all over. But the nectar is not always sweet. Often it is very bitter. It took us nearly 3 centuries to realize that these stories have fed us tales of misogyny, a mistrust for every relationship with the word step in it, a warped correlation between size and evil, and not to miss a mention of the glorification of a thief who stole from a giant just because he could. How deep in our bones is all this? The hapless, pretty girl who always needs rescuing, the evil stepmother, the bad, ugly stepsisters, ugly now almost being a step in for evil. Anybody who does not conform to the world standards of beauty or normalcy is viewed with mistrust and suspicion. Where do you think that gut feel came from? In the formative years of a child, we are fed the worldview that a girl only needs to look pretty and boys get to go on adventures. This brings me to the power of storytelling. Who gets to tell the story, and what is the text? The subtext of these fairy tales is that cunning is associated with the physically malformed, and that a beauty with helplessness. So this is quite this thing. We as parents need to interrogate what passes between our ears and that of our family. But luckily, times change, people change, and stories evolve too. Comic books have come of age with the female at the center stage of many a storyline, be it Wonder Woman, Star Wars, or even Disney. They are beginning to reflect this change. And the new generation has a new mythology to look forward to and no longer need to be troubled by the problematic tales of the past. But fairy tales are not the only stories we tell our children. Jokes tell a story too. Jokes tell a story of what is acceptable to laugh at or who is acceptable to be laughed down upon. When we tell a joke to a child, we are shaping their future. We are shaping their perception of what lies within the boundary of decency and what does not. So one time pretty long ago, when I was quite sure about the orientation of both my children, I jokingly and rather insensitively told them, feel free to choose your own life partner, but I have a condition. The boy gets to marry a girl and the girl gets to marry a boy. Why? They asked in unison. Why indeed? I would not have made this insensitive joke had I not been sure of their orientation. But with that why, I realized that I carried within me centuries of ingrained, indoctrinated nonsense that had made my thinking so narrow and shallow. My apologies, baby log, I told them. Years later, I would change it to, feel free to choose your own life partner with responsibility, period. Caste, color, sex, orientation, no bar. The key word being responsibility. I wrote about this on Quora. It is incredible how many children are out there afraid to come out and speak openly to their parents. I do hope that there will be many more such Indian homes which will reflect this change in mindset. Stories of children shaping their parents, one idea at a time. But jokes are not the only insensitive things going around. Innocent, innocuous sounding stories mess with the minds of even adults. Many of you may have received this as a WhatsApp forward from some Tauji in your family group or somebody. But just a short recap for those who may not. So a husband and wife had this agreement that they would not open the door for anyone at night. One night the husband's parents came visiting. They knocked on the door. The husband looked at his wife. He remembered they had a pact. So he did not open the door. They went away. A while later, that same night, the wife's parents came. They knocked on the door too. The wife looked at her husband. She remembered they had an agreement. But she had tears in her eyes and I can't do this to my parents. And she opened the door for them. The husband said nothing. They had 2 boys, and a few years later, they had a baby girl. The husband threw a lavish party for her. He invited everybody he knew in town for that. So that night, his wife asked him, she said, we had these 2 boys, you didn't do anything for them, and now this grand party for your daughter, why? So the husband said, because she is the one who will open the door for me. Daughters are so sweet, so special, right? They hold your hand for a while, but they hold your heart for a lifetime, is the tagline of this story. But I beg to differ. I call out the hypocrisy in this one. Stories like these foster and fester the belief that daughters will take care of their parents till the end of their lives and be sweet and tender and loving. But a son is a son only till the time he becomes a husband, and thereafter he will do whatever his wife asks him to do. Stories like these put us in a box behind bars and they just cage our thinking. Such small stories create even smaller mentalities. And when those people who throw these stories at us, when they realize that we are lapping it up, WhatsApp, Facebook, you must have read it 100 times, this story. They decide to throw even more stories like this, resulting in a dumbing down of society. Indian TV serials are mute testimony to this. Not so mute, but yes, they are testimony to that. So remember I said about stories shaping children? I think we need to be more wary about the stories that shape adults. Stories that deceive have consequences. Entire parallel realities exist where stories have been created by people in positions of power, media, who's who, and worst of all, people themselves. Stories that scratch an itch, they seem true, they feel right. These untruths spread far faster than any truth. And that has consequences. The allure of passing a lie around, the thrill of watching it grow. Did you hear? Did you hear? That thrill far outweighs the need to search for the bland, boring truth. And that has consequences too. Often we elect the liar who tells us the most comfortable untruth, or we trust our valuables with that company which tells us the most comforting lie. So the end result of these things, the end game of these people is for us to mistrust everything that we read, see, hear, until we get disgusted and we withdraw. These stories erode trust. #MeToo stands testimony to the erosion of trust between individuals. The shame is a cross for the people to bear. So with this, you see, I salute those brave women and men who dared come out and speak about this trust deficit, who dared demand justice for themselves and call out the perpetrator of the crime, and who refused to be the victim anymore. Such stories shape not just individuals, they shape entire societies. A society, when you tell enough stories in a society, it becomes common knowledge. After a while, it becomes the culture of that place. When you go forward in time and you look back, that culture is history. History is kept alive by those who remember to tell those stories down generations, and by those who keep a record. Often the two are not the same people. The British ruled us for 250 years. In that time, several historians came, studied our culture, traditions, people. They wrote about us. They wrote so many, they read our books, they spoke to people, all in English. The regional voice was lost. Who would tell us these stories if they are not in English? When was the last time any of you ever read an entire book in Hindi or your mother tongue or Sanskrit, which has been our language for thousands of years? With the decline of Sanskrit, we are beginning to lose a voice. We are beginning to lose a perspective. We are beginning to lose stories about ourselves told by ourselves. Instead, we will be left with stories about us told by others. And we need to be wary of those stories. Who tells what and to what gain? And whose voice did we lose? Because wonderful things happen when we tell our own stories. When we go to places where there are guides who show us around, they bring the place alive with those stories. A tiny place like Kanyakumari is brimming with the wealth of stories inside of her. Whenever I go to a new place, I make it a point to listen to the stories of that place and come home and tell my children about it. So after our visit to Kanyakumari, I wrote a poem for my then young children to go to school and tell their friends about it. This one, The Land of the Three Seas, we called it. A tale of love, deceit, rejection, of how the world was saved from destruction because a lady didn't wed, a Kanya Kumari forever. A temple speaks of a cursed gem, of an arrogant king who refuses to bow before the deity, of a cunning architect who deliberately made the door to the sanctum sanctorum so small that the king was forced to bend before he entered. A rock stands testament to the awakening of Vivekananda just before the iconic speech which would inspire an entire generation of Indians. Countless such stories abound all the world over. Stories of heroes who chiseled a mark here, left a scar there, leaving the world transformed each time. Some heroes are famous. Gandhi, Mandela, Malala, Dravid, my favorite. Their biographies inspire. Their lives a beacon to follow. But somewhere among these are the nameless heroes of the world. People who thought they should and who decided they would. Their names etched forever in our minds. Be it that solitary man who stood in front of those tanks in Tiananmen Square, or be it that single soldier who refused to salute to Hitler. Their stories, their actions forever will stand as a symbol of the power of one. Their names do not live on, but their stories do. I want to be sure that I emphasize at this point that not all of us may get an opportunity to tell our stories. Sometimes it's not in our hands. But while there is still strength in your mind and body, Be sure to keep your story ready to pass on like a baton to the future. It is a cliche to be standing at the podium and say that you, everyone, has the power to effect change. The problem with you young ones is that sometimes you dream too high, and when it doesn't come true, you get dejected. Your go-to story doesn't have to be as grand as Gandhi's or as brave as Malala's or as dangerous as General Saab's. Your go-to story can be small. It can be in your school, your workplace, your community, even your home. So my go-to story is from my campus of the then REC, now NIT Trichy. So campus interviews were on, and there were this reputed South-based company who had come for interviewing us. So being what may be termed as a bit of an enthu cutlet, I landed up pretty early at the placement office with my resume all spruced up to give to him. The company representative said, "Girls need not apply, company policy." My nickname in college was Darth Vader. I made sure that guy that day knew why. So I said, unless you interview both girls and boys, I will not permit you to do the interviews in our college. All or none. So the firm was sent back. They returned after a fortnight, having changed their company policy, and I was among the first girls to be selected there. They had to hastily construct toilets and all for us. And that the first person I met there on my very first day would be my husband. He's sitting right there. It's a story I'll leave for another time. But I'm here today because of my connect with the youngsters on Quora. I am but a tiny cog in the wheel of the world, maybe not even that. But even I have saved a life from getting lost by talking to a child all night and talking him out of taking it. Even I have restored the self-esteem of a child by showing her a mirror and showing her her worth. Even I have brought one estranged child back to his parents, saved one marriage. And I believe that I have effected a tiny change in the small world around me. That story is mine to tell, of the power of one to make a difference, no matter how small. What's yours? Thank you.